Good morning and welcome to another edition of Power and Strategy TV. My name is Tony Maceo. I am your gracious host on this YouTube channel. I'm getting a little bit more comfortable with doing this thing, so I'm probably going to start putting up more videos. My initial nervousness is subsiding, and so again, I'm getting more comfortable. So, on this chilly morning, one thing that has been trending, or one thing that is trending on social media, is the Netflix documentary "Who Killed Malcolm X," which was a documentary that was narrated and told from the perspective of Abdur Rahman Muhammad. Now, Mr. Muhammad is a lecturer, activist, scholar, and historian. Although he said that he doesn't have, the credentials as far as a master's degree, the work that he produced here in this documentary is nothing short of mind blowing. And in fairness to Mr. Muhammad, I think I have to give proper credit and attribution to the sources that are contained in this documentary, or the sources upon which this documentary is based upon. And one of them, of course, is the outstanding scholar and professor and historian at Baltimore City College, Dr. Zach Kondo. I've spoken to Dr. Kondo Professor Kondo on many occasions. I look forward to speaking to him again, hopefully. I've put in a contact to his office. Hopefully, I'll have an interview with him on Genosha TV on this subject. But the interview, excuse me, not the interview, the documentary lays out some very mind blowing revelations to the public. I have to say, in fairness, that this subject is not entirely new to me. I began looking into Malcolm X's assassination as early as 1992. At that time, you could actually get access to this paperwork through the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act was a piece of legislation passed to give ordinary citizens access to government documents that were not previously disclosed on politics or any form of information related to government action, misdeeds, or what have you. But the problem with it is that, one, I had a deep lack of understanding of the culture of intelligence. Two, I didn't understand the vernacular that they were using in the reports. Three, there was also this kind of game that government agencies, such as the FBI, tend to play with researchers, private citizen researchers. And it's the thing of exhausting you or weaponizing bureaucracy. Now, what do I mean when I say weaponizing bureaucracy? When you would send the requests in, they would frequently lose the request that you sent. The personnel was generally very uncooperative and hostile, to the point of just being downright belligerent. Also, they would give you incorrect documents. You had to actually know what it was you wanted. And that was kind of difficult due to the fact that you had never seen the document before, but you had to sufficiently describe it so as to allow them to give you the correct document. And they would frequently give you incorrect document requests and responses. And keep in mind that this is costly at the time. If you're not in the Washington, D.C., in the D.C., Baltimore, Virginia area, this information would have to be delivered to you by mail, which drew upon, or which brought another uh, obstacle to research, which was the exorbitant amount that you paid for delivery costs through the mail at that time for me on what I was making. The bureaucracy in terms of what I just described was abysmal. I mean, it was just horrible. But the thing is, for me, it was very difficult. Now, what I could follow were the surveillance reports on Malcolm X and a lot of the wiretaps uh, that were recorded on Elijah Muhammad, his family, and his Elijah Muhammad and his family and a lot of his top aides in particular. And what you begin to see and what is shown in this documentary is that Malcolm's problems began with the quote unquote royal family. Now I know there are a lot of people on that are in the Nation of Islam, and they, of course, their positions are going to be understandably biased. So what their positions are going to be, they're going to say, well, Malcolm X was not perfect. Yes, we know that there is the circumstantial evidence of a specific affair that Malcolm X may or may not have had with a former female member of the Nation of Islam. They're also going to bring up uh, some revelations around Malcolm X's love life pertaining to a woman to whom he was engaged before Betty Shabazz. Yes, we know all of that. All of this is in an attempt to show that Malcolm X wasn't perfect. Well, any person that was objectively minded knows that Malcolm X wasn't perfect. This is only news to the hardcore, recalcitrant, and retrograde sectors of the conscious community, of the pro Black community. They're the ones that are looking for a perfect Malcolm X. All serious scholars and historians, the one thing that they tend to do, and the one thing that was done in Malcolm X's case, was to show Malcolm X as an extraordinary individual who had his flaws. So, in that way, they humanized him. But even in humanizing him, the same way they did with Martin Luther King Jr., it does not take away from his extraordinary contribution and his extraordinary importance to the Black community. Nothing cannot detract from that contribution or importance, not even his flaws. So the defense mechanism of showing that Malcolm X wasn't perfect it really is a time wasting futile effort, and it doesn't accomplish anything but other than expose the arguments of those that believe in the divinity and the deification of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who himself was extraordinary, who himself made uh, an inordinate contribution to Black America. Uh, in spite of his flaws, in spite of his shortcomings, in spite of uh, his habits, his appetites. So the idea of trying to deconstruct Malcolm by dehumanizing him or rehumanizing him or pointing out his flaws does not detract away from the story, and it does not detract away from the credibility of the scholars who painstakingly put in decades worth of research to bring this information to light. And the individuals that I'm speaking of, by the way, these people were the ones who helped me understand the research, who helped me interpret what I was reading. And the individuals include, but are not limited to, Carl Evans, who was a freelance reporter for the Washington Times, who wrote the book, one of the best books on the assassination, which is known as Scandal and a piece of invective among Nation of Islam aficionados. He wrote the book, The Judas Factor. Carl Evans has not been given his proper amount of credit and attribution for the work that he did, the hard work and research that he did in his book, The Life and Death, The Judas Factor, The Plot to Kill Malcolm X. Now, there are also other books to some extent, but they pale in comparison in terms of comprehensive quality when it comes to Carl Evans's book. There's Peter Goldman's book on Malcolm X's assassination. There's George Brightman's book on the assassination of Malcolm X. And there's one other book, and I can't recall the author at this time, but it is called The Assassination of Malcolm X. And then there's one done by some man known, his name is Bruce Perry, and it's really very unforgettable. It is very forgettable. And it is, for those that are interested in the research, it is worth picking up and reading just so you can understand his perspective, because it does contain useful pieces and glimpses into Malcolm X's murder. But again, that's the book by Bruce Perry. But the two most, in addition to Carl Evans's book, The Judas Factor, the other two most definitive treatises on Malcolm X's murder is, without a doubt, the book Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X by Dr. or Professor Zach Kondo from Baltimore City College, historian and scholar and professor there, holding forth in the Department of History, as well as Dr. Manning Marable's magnum opus, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. Now, that book, the latter of the two I just mentioned, has been attacked as being um, scandal, rumor. I think Dr. Furpo Carr wrote a response called a book called The Re-Assassination of Malcolm X, where he takes Manning Marable to task. Dr. Jared Ball wrote a book that takes Dr. Marable to task. But most of these books are around the revelations of Malcolm X's domestic life before the Nation of Islam. And it also takes to task, or takes Marable to task, which is probably one of the only valid criticisms in both of the treatises, or the response or the replies, is Marable's slanting of Malcolm X toward a socialist perspective. And I can see the reason for the criticism in a lot of those responses, but the rest of it is just um, a knee-jerk emotional reaction to some of the revelations that Marable makes, that in effect humanizes Malcolm, but it doesn't detract away from his brilliance, and it doesn't detract away from his stature in the history of not only Black America, but in world history. As a Muslim figure, as an international figure in the context of Muslim history. So, with that being said, let's get right in. I'm not going to make this a long podcast, or I'm probably going to do it in segments. I'm also working on getting either Dr. Uh, Kondo or Mr. Muhammad uh, as a guest, either on Power and Strategy TV. Well, it probably won't be Power and Strategy TV. It'll probably be on Genosha TV, because that's my other channel that I have for 40%, excuse me, 90% less niggardry. So I'm working on that interview, and we'll see how it pans out. But anyway, when you look at this documentary, when you watch this documentary, and when you read the reports, and you read the books and the treatises, and you do the research, one of the things that you discover quick is the time honored practice of a lot of niggardry. And it's not absent in any organization. It's also prevalent in white organizations too, but I'm not talking about white organizations. I'm talking about Black organizations. So, what you see in this documentary is a lot of niggardry with the same hallmarks: greed, slothfulness, gluttony, jealousy, envy, and just all around backstabbing and backbiting that you see prevalent in organizations, especially Black organizations. Again, I'm talking about Black organizations. And because the Nation of Islam was made up of Black people, that means that it's not exempt from niggardry. The Nation of Islam recruited heavily from the lower class, of the lower segment of Black America. And there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, all organizations tend to recruit from among the most dispossessed and marginalized sectors of society. There's nothing abnormal about it. The only problem is that when you talk about organizations, effective organizations or revolutionary organizations contain, in order to be successful, they must contain a brain trust from among the most educated sectors of society. Now, that doesn't mean, because I know what some of these Negroes are going to say, does he have to be educated in white folks' colleges in order to be? Yes. I'm sorry that that gives you such a source of contention, but yes. If you do a historical analysis, perhaps with the exception of the Haitian Revolution, but even Toussaint L'Ouverture and what was the man's name? Not Bookman Dada, Dessalines, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Even these men had a degree of formal education, military education, in order to contribute to the Haitian Revolution. So my point is that you have to have an elite group of educated people to serve as the brain trust to these social movements. Now, that brings a lot of consternation and trepidation to the lower class segment of Black folks in America, because what we have, or what we've had since the late 1960s, has been the emergence of hood nigger nationalism. And that happened because uh, the Black middle class lost influence due to the emergence of the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s. I'm not going to get off into that digression at this point, but what I'll say is that the poor sectors of the Black community were elevated into discourse without restraint. And so that is what has happened, and it has lessened the quality of leadership in Black America. And it's a class discussion that Black people are not comfortable having, but what needs to be had. But anyway, back to my point. What you see when you read these books, such as Zach Condo's The Unraveling of the Assassination of Malcolm X, The Judas Factor, and Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention by Dr. Manning Marable, what you see is um, the usual degree of niggardry that has become uh, prevalent in Black America. You see it on display, full in all of its horror and hideous nature. And one of the places, or one of the most prominent place where you see this niggardry displayed, is among Elijah Muhammad's family. Not so much of Elijah Muhammad per se, as his family. And who am I talking about when I say his family? It is most explicitly, most openly or directly, it is his son Elijah Muhammad Jr. It is his daughter Ethel Marie. It is his son Herbert Muhammad, who went on to become Muhammad Ali's manager, and who it has been alleged bilked and swindled Ali out of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. This is public record. Ali subsequently sued Herbert Muhammad in federal court, even though they remain friends. And to some extent, I think even Wallace to a certain extent. But Wallace's role is rather obscured by his cordial relationship to Malcolm X. And that is something that has a lot of nuances, and I won't get into. But what you see in this documentary, and what you will see if you read the FBI files, which are now free on the internet, you can actually request these documents, and you can actually read these documents if you go to the FBI's website, which I know some of you won't do because you're paranoid about them tracking your computers. I get it. But if once you read the FBI files and the documents, and you read the books, and again, it's the Judas Factor by Carl Evans, Malcolm X: A Life of Reinvention by Dr. Manning Marable, and Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X by Professor Zach Kondo, you see that the detractors, Malcolm's biggest detractors, are in Elijah Muhammad's family. Again, Elijah Muhammad Jr., Herbert Muhammad, Ethel Marie, Elijah Muhammad's daughter, who is married to Raymond Sharif, who is the supreme captain of the Nation of Islam, who was actually the figurehead, because the man who was really running it was, of course, Elijah Jr., and Wallace Muhammad, and there are others, which later include Elijah Muhammad's own wife, Clara, who becomes one of Malcolm X's detractors at some point. And what you see is that Elijah Muhammad's children are greedy. They are, to call them mediocre in terms of ability to call them mediocre in terms of mental aptitude, to call them mediocre in terms of critical thinking and planning is to do them justice, because they were simpletons. I'm sorry to say it, but they were. They were simpletons, and they were self-entitled and spoiled from the wealth of that was being generated by Malcolm X's activism. And it's clear to a certain extent that they did not believe in the doctrine that their father was espousing. They did not believe that he was the prophet or the messenger of Allah. That's clear. There is another YouTube channel on here that you can go and observe a lot of this, or you can go and listen to a lot of interviews related to this material. One of which is, it's a YouTube channel called Laugh at First Sight. The guy that runs it is a guy by the name of, I think his name is Jason. I don't know what his last name is, but he conducts these interviews. He is the black version of Vlad TV here on YouTube, in that he does, all of these interviews with people that were there during the time, people that were in the Nation of Islam during the time. And one of the interviews, that he does is with a gentleman by the name of Leon, and who I think his name is Leon. I think that's Leon Muhammad. I believe that's his name. And he was a member of the Nation of Islam out of Philadelphia that later converted to Orthodox Islam. And he does another interview with a gentleman by the name of, I forget what the man's name is. I'm sorry. He's 80 some odd years old. And you can look him up. He's 80 some odd years old. I mean, he's a clean old brother. He talks like a pimp. You can tell he used to be a hustler. And he actually says he used to be a hustler. Melchizedek, that's his name. It just came to me. Melchizedek is his name. And he does this interview with Leon Muhammad and Melchizedek, and they give their perspectives. Leon is probably the most descriptive in terms of uh, speaking on the behavior of Elijah Muhammad's son, in particular Herbert. And he also goes into depth about, Herbert's hypocrisy and his kind of wayward lifestyle when compared to the doctrines of the Nation of Islam. He talks about that extensively. And he talks about, in essence, the assassination of Malcolm X. And he says the same thing. He talks about and verifies and validates the same thing that is in this documentary. So you have the FBI saying it. You have the scholars and historians saying it. You have the people that were there saying it. So you would think that this information would at some instance become a degree of fact. But we have to understand that a certain degree, history is always subject to interpretation. So there can never be any true absolute fact in the most objective sense. There can be no true absolute facts when we look at the murder of Malcolm X. But what we see here is that the genesis of Malcolm X's assassination comes from Elijah Muhammad's family. Elijah Muhammad initially is more or less a defender and protector of Malcolm initially. This changes after the murder of Ronald Stokes, which will be alluded to in this documentary. And another thing that is alluded to or shown in this documentary is the suspected FBI informant, John Ali. Curiously enough, when approached or asked whether he is in fact, or he was in fact, an FBI informant, and John Ali, just to be clear, was the national secretary of the Nation of Islam. He was appointed to that post in 1960, shockingly by Malcolm X himself. He was not appointed, excuse me. He was nominated, I guess I could say. He was suggested or nominated by Malcolm X for that post. And Elijah Muhammad accepted Malcolm's recommendation, accepted Malcolm X's suggestion to appoint John Ali as national secretary. And now Carl Evans and others have suspected and pointed out that John Ali was, in fact, an FBI informant. Now, of course, Ali is going to deny this on camera, but he does state a curious, he does make a curious statement in the documentary that he was presented to J. Edgar Hoover to be an informant, and Hoover turned him down. I find that a bit incredulous. Is his response to the accusation. John Ali is featured in this documentary, as well as Lance Shabazz, as well as former members of Newark Temple number 25, which was where the killers of Malcolm X came from. The documentary tells you the names of those killers. It even describes the shotgun, the man who wielded the shotgun, which actually was the actual weapon that took Malcolm X's life. It was the very weapon that did the most damage because it was fired and it hit Malcolm in the chest. So the man who fired this weapon is identified in the documentary, Al Mustafa Shabazz, formerly William Bradley from the Newark Temple number 25. And the type of indifference or haphazard acceptance of this man's role by people and the elders of that community is also something that is very shocking. And it is something that is a metaphor for how Black people treat their leaders. Black people have an annoying tendency of crucifying their saviors and freeing their traitors. That's one thing that becomes increasingly evident when you look at this documentary. This man is sent off. Malcolm X's murderer is sent to his grave with a virtual hero celebration. And it's as though his deed, which is an open secret in the community, which is an open secret in the Newark community, is just dismissed as just this irrelevant asterisk in history. It's just straight out dismissed. And they are lauding and celebrating this man. And oddly enough, they use the religion of Islam to forgive him for this abominable crime. And the reason why that's so interesting to me is because when people use Christianity, when Black people use Christianity as a tool of forgiveness, niggas jump up and down and scream about the faults and the shortcomings and all of the flaws with Christianity and how we shouldn't be Christian and how it makes us passive and tame and effeminate and weak and subordinate. But then here are these people using Islam as a degree or as a tool to forgive the murderer of one of the most prolific Muslim leaders in world history. I found that to be a bizarre contradiction. I found that to be I found that to be hypocritical. I found that to be a degree of hypocrisy of epic proportions. So the same thing that they would look down and curse Christians for doing, Muslims are patted on the back for doing. There is a section or there's a portion of this documentary where a guy says, one of the Muslims he says these words. He says that Islam concerns itself with justice. But then he turns right around and says later in the documentary, he says later in the documentary that their religion allows them or does not allow them to concern themselves with justice where the victim of another Muslim is a famous person or a person of world renown. So I guess justice is divisible when it comes to their friends or when it comes to their buddies. Now, to be fair, this is not something that is just common to this is what niggas do in general. And this is my point. There has been, and what you see in this documentary is the theme of Black people excusing, co-signing, signifying, and ratifying the niggatry of the most gully, the most grimy niggas in creation, and condemning anyone that will dare to hold up a mirror or hold the Black community to a specific standard or code of conduct. Just come on out and say it. Black people love grimy niggas. So while we can say on one hand that there is a civil war between niggas and Black people at times will extend an olive branch or they will have a truce with niggas. And this is why we can't get rid of niggas. And this is why we will never win the war between Black people and niggas. As the last poets would say, I love niggas because niggas are me. And I think that's part of the problem. But in this documentary, what you see are apologists for the Nation of Islam and apologists for Mosque number 25 in Newark. And what you see are the objective historians that prove the case that the Nation of Islam was involved. And before I go any further here, there's going to be a lot of confusion around who they say killed Malcolm X. Let me clear up my position and the position that is uh, articulated in the books that I mentioned. Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, The Judas Factor, and Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X. It is clear that from the documents, and it is clear that from these books and the research, that Malcolm X's murder is the result of a convergence of interests. These convergence of interests are as follows: the New York Police Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the Nation of Islam. But one of the tactics of each institution has been to point the finger at the other. Now, anyone that is in law will tell you that this is an old criminal defense tactic. What happens is that if there are multiple co-defendants in a criminal case, if there are multiple defendants and they're co-defendants in a criminal case, one of the things that the defense attorneys will do is that the defense attorneys will point the finger or the blame at one of the co-defendants. The co-defendants will then turn around, that co-defendant will then turn around and point the blame back at the co-defendant who's blaming him for the crime. What this does, or what this is it is a slick way of trying to manufacture reasonable doubt. So what you do is you blame the other guy. He did it. No, he did it. No, he did it. No, he did it. And it confuses the jury to the extent that it results in an acquittal in or on both defendants, because you're unsure as to who was involved and who did what. You don't see them as accomplices or accessories. You see them as conflicting individuals with conflicting motives that may or may not have pulled the trigger in the event of the criminal act. Now, sometimes this is effective, sometimes it isn't effective, but nevertheless, it is a tactic that has been practiced or that is practiced in a criminal trial where there are multiple defendants. And this is what is happening in the case of Malcolm X, or the murder of Malcolm X. The FBI is pointing the finger at the nation. The nation is pointing the finger back at the FBI. Then the FBI points the finger at the New York Police Department. The New York Police Department is then pointing the finger back at the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is then pointing the finger back at the New York Police Department. And it's a shell game. It's a parlor game because it prevents you from seeing that elements of each unit, elements of each institution are intricately involved in Malcolm X's murder. Each of them are accessories before, after, and during the fact. They are accomplices. And this is where you see this is the most intricate part of the whole documentary. This is the most compromising point where you see how all of these institutions are working together to facilitate this murder. But as long as they have people taking sides, it confuses everyone as to the true participants in this crime. Because to be certain, John Ali, who I am convinced is an FBI informant, despite his denials, despite his weak and ineffectual denials, it's clear that he was in New York City the night before the assassination. The FOI individuals put him there. Several members of the FOI and several of the key members involved in this assassination put John Ali in New York City the night before the murder. John Ali is not alone in being an FBI informant. There are many others. Gene Roberts, who was an informant for the New York Police Department's Bureau of Special Services and Investigations, who was one of Malcolm X's bodyguards. And the FBI also had 9 informants, which you'll see in this documentary, 9 informants in the Audubon Ballroom on the night of the murder, or on the afternoon of the murder, rather. And there is certainly a great degree or substantial degree of circumstantial evidence, a substantial degree of circumstantial evidence. I hope I said that right. A substantial degree of circumstantial evidence that shows that the man who carried the shotgun, or the man who wielded the shotgun that took Malcolm X's life, there is substantial circumstantial evidence to show that this man himself was an FBI informant. Because after this murder, this man commits uh, a, a litany of felonies before he is finally caught and imprisoned, one of which is a bank robbery in Livingston, New Jersey. He also has been convicted of terroristic threats before 9/11. He was also convicted of violent assaults, sexual assaults, armed robberies. I mean, this guy was a violent man. And the guy who I'm speaking of is this Al Mustafa Shabazz. It's clear that he was a violent man. But on each of these cases, this man received preferential treatment, numerous continuances. He somehow found the money to afford expensive attorneys. You can clearly see that this man is being assisted. You can imply, rather. Anybody with any common sense can clearly see that this man is receiving assistance from the state. And the only time the state would protect someone that committed these crimes to this degree is when they are their informants, when they have an interest in this individual that goes beyond just that of a private citizen. You can clearly see that this man has to have some type of relationship with police intelligence. But he was just too niggerish. His problem was he was just too niggerish to stay out of trouble. He had gotten away with the crime of the decade, but he was just too niggerish to sit down and stay out of trouble. So my point here is that you have elements of each institution involved in this crime. And yes, the Nation of Islam was involved in this crime. If by no other indication than by allowing Norman 3X Butler, today Muhammad Aziz, and the late Khalil Islam, Thomas 15X Johnson, to allow these men to languish in prison, knowing that they had nothing to do with that murder. As a matter of fact, if you get into this research, which I know many of you won't, both Thomas 15X Johnson and Muhammad Aziz, Khalil Islam, which was his name when he passed, Khalil Islam and Khalil Islam and Muhammad Aziz would later contact Captain Yusuf Shaw, the late Captain Yusuf Shaw, who was the captain of Mosque number 7 in Harlem, contacted him when this happened. They were on the phone with Captain Yusuf Shaw, who's another piece of work. They were on the phone with him minutes after this happened. So they were nowhere near the Audubon Ballroom at the time this happened. Eyewitness testimony says that they were nowhere near the Audubon Ballroom when this happened. But yet the Nation of Islam allowed these men to be sacrificed to allow Malcolm X's true killers, one of which I am convinced is an FBI informant, to escape. Where did this plot come from? This plot came from the quote unquote royal family. The royal family being, and this is my personal opinion based on the evidence, Elijah Muhammad Jr., Herbert Muhammad is involved, the National Secretary, the aforementioned FBI informant John Ali, and Raymond Sharif, assisted by the late Minister James Shabazz, Captain Yusuf Shaw, and other principalities in the Nation of Islam, which do not come to my mind at this moment. Again, this is my personal opinion and analysis based upon a review of the evidence, of which there is substantial. Of which there is a significant or substantial amount, I should say. But it's clear here that the Nation of Islam was involved. And anybody that tells you that the Nation of Islam was not involved they're just lying to you. Okay, they're just flat out lying to you. And the reason they're lying to you is because they have a vested interest. They need to believe, and they say this in the documentary, there are substantial numbers of Black people in the Nation of Islam that needs to believe that Elijah Muhammad was divine and infallible. They're protecting the infallibility and the legacy and the fragile deification or divinity of Elijah Muhammad. That's what they're doing. And by association, Minister Louis Farrakhan. Now, the one thing you don't see in this documentary, Louis Farrakhan doesn't play any part in the assassination of Malcolm X other than that article he wrote. But Minister Farrakhan wrote that article as a believer. But he played no part in the assassination of Malcolm X. He played no part in that. It is clear where the murderers came from. It is clear where the murder plot came from here. It's clear. And that That plot does not involve Minister Louis Farrakhan. I'm going to say that again. That plot does not involve Minister Louis Farrakhan. It does not. If anything, this documentary exonerates Minister Louis Farrakhan. But because they know that our community is emotional, and we will be unable to categorize and compartmentalize Louis Farrakhan's contributions from the stain, the horrible stain that this murder has left on the history of Black America. They know that we'll blindly start to blame him. And so a lot of people are working overtime to distance themselves from this murder, and because they want to distance him from this murder. But truth be told, the only time anybody says anything to Louis Farrakhan about this murder is when Louis Farrakhan is attempting to chastise Black America for being lazy, trifling, and shiftless. Black folks don't like being disciplined. Black folks don't like being criticized. So Negroes that don't even know anything about Malcolm X become Malcolm X defenders and propagators when they're being criticized about how lazy and shiftless and undisciplined we are. So what they do is they throw Malcolm X up in Louis Farrakhan's face as a defense mechanism because they don't want him getting on their ass about how scandalous and shady we are. So Malcolm X becomes our attack dog against him to defend ourselves against his criticism. Or when Louis Farrakhan speaks out against our uncomfortable or tenuous allegiances with people that we really don't have any business being involved with, then we throw up Malcolm X as a type of cross that one would throw up in the face of a vampire in order to repel him and his criticism. They're using Malcolm X as a shield. They don't know anything about Malcolm X and they don't care anything about Malcolm X. They're just using Malcolm X's name and appropriating his murder as a means to get somebody off of their ass. But again, Louis Farrakhan is not involved in the assassination of Malcolm X. That's clear. So where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? The documentary is pushing for a reopening of the murder of the investigation, and from all indications on the internet, this is presently happening. I don't believe anything will become of it, mainly because everyone who knows anything is dead. The principals, all of the principals, with the exception of Talmadge, who is still alive and who was not interviewed in this documentary, but interviews with Gil Noble and Tony Brown were actually used in the documentary. Thomas Hagen is the only one. Oh, excuse me. Today he is Talmadge. He is the only one, and I think he has another Muslim name now, but he's the only one still alive now. All the rest of them are dead. The shotgun wielder, the Mustafa Al Mustafa Shabazz, the man who wielded the shotgun, he died 2 years ago in 2018. He died at the time they were making this documentary, at the time they were filming this documentary. So everyone who knows anything is dead, with the exception of John Ali. And of course, he isn't talking. Of course, he isn't talking. I think Elijah Muhammad Jr. is still alive. And you know, he's not talking either. So the people that know aren't talking. And the people and the others who know are dead. You're not going to get any witness testimony from a corpse. So what I suspect will happen is they will open this investigation. I don't suspect anything will come out of it other than new facts and revelations, and it will provide some degree of closure for those who have been wanting answers. But in terms of bringing anyone to justice, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen, because in order to do that, that means they would have to call those members of the FBI that observed and stated in their reports who the killers were. and those people are not going to testify either. Agent Fulton, who is also depicted in the um, documentary, Fulton is not coming to testify. You can forget about that. He will. The FBI and the intelligence agencies have a shield to prevent them from disclosing their felonious acts, their prior felonious acts against American citizens. That shield is called national security. It's even stronger now than it was then. So Agent Fulton is not going to be forced to testify in that criminal trial or in the event of a criminal investigation or criminal trial. Agent Fulton is not going to testify. You can forget that. The gangly looking New York City detective John Boza, he's not going to testify either. Or if he testifies, he's going to testify to not knowing anything. Gene Roberts, I suspect he's dead. He could be dead. I haven't heard anything about him in a while. I do know he's a drunk and a derelict because you know that duplicity of character eats at their soul. So I'm sure you'll get something out of him, but it won't be much. So the people that you need to actually make the case, they're dead. And the others are just not talking. But nevertheless, this documentary and the research surrounding it needed to be done. It needed to be done. It had to be done. It was necessary. So, with that being said, it's about time for me to dip. I know I missed some major parts, but I will be writing an article on the assassination, on this documentary, excuse me. I will be writing a piece for the Negro Manosphere on this documentary that I'm going to put up either today or tomorrow. Be looking for it. I'm going to make my foray back into blogging after a lengthy absence because I'm still working on my own ebook that will be published very soon. Uh, Shout out to my partner, the Fat Mac, uh, over at MacCity.com. Shout out to C Boogie Productions. Shout out to the Black Brain Trust. Shout out to O'Shea Duke Jackson. Shout out to Nicole Michelle of the Inner Beauty Movement. Shout out to all my subscribers and patrons. Thank you for your support. I'm sure this is not the last I will have to say on this subject. I want it to be brief, but I guess in this case, brevity is about 54 minutes. So, with that being said, you guys have a nice day. My name is Tony Maceo. I'm out of here wishing you love, peace, and soul.